Hello and welcome to more history stuff. So this is the fifth and last instalment of the tale of Sir Adam Gurdon, the Outlaw Knight of Hampshire. I hope this series has been quite entertaining and shed some light on a character who is pretty much forgotten these days, but was a bit of a celebrity and a little bit of a local hero in his own day in the 13th century. And of course it relates to my new book, which is coming out on 31st of March, just a few days. And if anyone is interested, I've posted a link to the pre-order on Amazon at the foot of this video. So anyway, Adam Gurdon. The last we saw of him, he wasn't in a particularly good way. Summer of 1266, the Lord Edward had tracked Adam down to his lair, his camp inside Alton Wood in Hampshire, defeated Adam in single combat, taken him prisoner, and then executed all of his followers. They're all hanged on the trees of the wood around the camp. And poor old Adam, he's very badly wounded, loaded down with chains, and then packed off to Windsor as a prisoner. And he's actually given to the Queen, to Edward's mother, Eleanor of Provence. Edward presents his prisoner to her, I guess like a sort of medieval Mother's Day present. Here you are, Mum, have a prisoner. And he probably does this as an act of symbolism, really, because Adam had attacked and seized Eleanor's castle of Dunster in Somerset and used it as his headquarters. So this is almost like an act of revenge or natural justice. You've offended my mother, so now I'm going to give you to her and she can do with you whatever she likes. And as it turns out, Adam need not worry too much, because the royal policy at this point is not to kill rebels, it's not to execute them or even keep them in prison for extended periods. The policy is now to try and reconcile them and bring them back into the fold. I mean, not cheaply, of course, they've still got to pay. And Adam has to pay quite a stiff fine to recover his estates in Dorset and Hampshire and elsewhere. But he manages to find the money, and his outlaw past is not held against him. He is now, technically at least, a respectable, loyal subject again. And Edward, for the rest of Adam's career, for the following decades, Edward chooses to employ him and make use of him as a soldier and as an administrator. So, for instance, in 1276, when war breaks out with Wales, with Prince Llywelyn ap Griffith, Adam is posted to the Montgomery Command, which is one of the main English headquarters along the borders of Wales, the others being Shrewsbury, Rhuddlan and Chester. Montgomery is in the Middle Marches, adjacent to Powys, and Adam is put under the command of Roger Mortimer, who is his old friend, comrade, sometime enemy. Adam had served under Mortimer in Wales before, back in 1257, 20 years earlier, and that campaign had proved a complete disaster. But this one is very different. Edward is determined to get a result. He's fought and campaigned in Wales before he became king, not been very successful, and he knows by this point exactly what is required to win a war in Wales and to force the Prince, Llywelyn, to surrender. He's got a much greater grasp of the necessary logistics and the nuts and bolts of what you need to do to get this result, and that's exactly what he does. Adam, under the service or under the command of Roger Mortimer, would have been employed in the invasion of the Middle Marches, Welsh territory in central Powys. Mortimer and the Earl of Lincoln lead this sort of double-pronged campaign. They drive into mid-Wales, drive out Llywelyn's supporters and lay siege to the castle of Dolforwyn, which is Llywelyn's main stronghold on the middle section, the mid-sector of the borderlands. And if he loses this, if he loses this castle, then he pretty much loses control of that area and he has to abandon it. And this is what Edward's captains do. They take bits of territory piece by piece. They take a castle and then use that as a staging post to advance a little bit further, take another castle, and they keep forcing Llywelyn's men back and back and back. Very successful campaign, most successful and well organised campaign in Wales for at least 30 years, probably longer. And Adam, we don't know again what he did as an individual, except that he was serving as a banneret under Roger Mortimer. A banneret being a knight who had the right, the feudal right, to carry his own banner and his shield in war, probably with a small number of his own followers. So Adam has a much more sort of successful experience in Wales than he had 20 years earlier. And in England, Edward appoints him to various commissions. He doesn't seem to have any hesitation in trusting Adam either in a military sense or a political or administrative sense. And Adam is repeatedly appointed to various sort of local commissions in Hampshire. He's made a justice. Custos is the term. He's the keeper of the peace in Hampshire. And this continues as the years go by. Adam must have been a very strong and physically fit individual, because this is an era where most men, even noblemen, would consider themselves quite lucky to reach the age of 60. But Adam just keeps on going. He hits the 60 mark and just keeps on going, and he doesn't retire. He's obviously still fit to do his jobs. He carries on working for the king. And then in 1296, when a war has broken out with France, England is now under serious threat of invasion. Edward I is generally seen as a very aggressive king who invades other people. He doesn't get invaded himself. His own territory doesn't get invaded, but in fact it does on several occasions. And certainly in 1296 there are very real fears that the French are going to launch a full-scale invasion of southern England. And the atmosphere is quite similar to, say, a much later period like the 1800s, when the British thought that Napoleon was going to invade from France, or even take it up to 1939, 1940, when the British feared that the Nazis, that Hitler would launch a full-scale invasion of the British mainland, Operation Sea Lion, I think it was called. And this is what is going on in 1296. And as it happens, some very detailed plans have survived for the defence of the coastline of East Anglia, Kent and Sussex and Hampshire and Somerset, all around the sort of eastern to the southern and southwest coast. And these plans were used as a blueprint by later kings, notably Edward II and Edward III, who also had to draw up plans to defend their coasts against a possible French invasion. And as I said, these plans are remarkably detailed. They survive in full, held at the National Archives, and they reveal that what Edward does is he appoints his most sort of trusted knights and officials to posts of responsibility along each section of coastline. They're given command of what amounts to a series of private armies, and their job is to defend that sector of the coast in case of a French invasion. And one of these men is Adam Gurdon. Now bear in mind that this is the year 1296. Adam was probably born in about 1220, so he's in his late 70s at least by this stage, if not older. But he must still have been fit and competent to do his job and to be given this very responsible position, because otherwise Edward wouldn't have appointed him. There's no point appointing a bedridden, feeble old man to a post he cannot physically perform. But Adam is obviously still in a fit state. Quite remarkable, really. And I've got some facts and figures of this, as I said, this private army that he's given command of. So Adam was based at Portsmouth, where he was in charge of the money. He's in charge of distributing wages to his troops, as well as organising the defence of the coastline. He had control and command of men, both horse and foot, as well as money. He was also armed with full authority to do what he thought was needed to defend Hampshire. So bear in mind that this is a man who 30 years earlier he had been in charge of a sort of army of outlaws. He was very much a criminal, but now he is fully converted to a useful, faithful royal servant, and the king has enough confidence in him to give him charge of an army to actually defend England against an external, against a foreign invader. And in total, he has about just over 500 militia under his command. These are not really proper soldiers, they're civilians and peasants drawn from local towns and villages. And their job is to act as the first line of defence if the French manage to actually get on land, if they manage to land on the beaches, as Churchill might have said. And the English defence plan for 1296 is remarkably similar to the defence plan drawn up for the potential Nazi invasion in 1940. Because this army of militia that Adam and other officers have been given command of is very similar to the Home Guard. They're basically peasants, a bunch of, you can imagine, sort of old men and labourers and village boys and that sort of thing. They're probably not particularly well armed. You can imagine them with brooms and knives on sticks and pitchforks and sickles and all that sort of thing. And their job in case of invasion is to actually act as the first line of defence, just as the job of the Home Guard in 1940 was to do the same thing. They would take the full brunt of the invasion army when they landed. The French in 1296, Nazis almost 700 years later. And their job was just to try and soak up as much pressure as possible, to hold them off for as long as possible for the second and the third line, who were actually made up of proper soldiers. Edward posted knights and men-at-arms in the second and third line, and then in 1940 we had the Coldstream Guards, the British Grenadiers and the Free French. And on both occasions, in both instances, the plan, the strategy was the same. While the poor old peasants and the Home Guard were getting slaughtered trying to hold off the Nazis or the French or whatever, the real soldiers would curve round the flanks and attack the enemy from both sides at once. And Edward also had another trick up his sleeve. On the Isle of Wight, he had posted a secret garrison of about 100 armoured horsemen and crossbowmen. And when the French land on the beach and Adam's men would form this sort of thin red line of militia to try and stop them, and then you'd have the proper knights and men-at-arms behind them using these peasants almost like a human shield. When the French storm onto the beach and try and drive inland, these men on the Isle of Wight would suddenly spring from hiding, sail up onto the beach, hit the French in the rear, and at the same time the English fleet would sail down from Yarmouth and Portsmouth. Remember, Adam is based at Portsmouth, and hit the French fleet in the flank. And again, this is very similar to what was planned for 1940, when the idea was that the Royal Navy would sail down from Scapa Flow all the way down the British coast and attack the German fleet while their men were struggling to get a foothold on shore. So it's quite interesting that the plans and the strategy for defending the English coastline has not changed very much over the centuries. And the other coincidence or point of equivalence, of course, is that neither invasion did actually happen. In 1296, the French did attempt to make some limited landings. I think they managed to get ashore at Dover, but they're not very successful. They're quite easily repelled. Some French ships are wrecked off the coast at Hythe, I think, in Kent. But generally, this attempt at invasion is not very well organised, and because the defences of England are relatively well organised, they're able to repel anything that comes at them. And you have to wonder whether the French king, Philip IV, whether his attitude was a bit similar to that of Adolf Hitler in 1940, whereby if the invasion could have succeeded, then that's fine, but he's not going to really lose any sleep over it. He's not that determined. It's more like a distraction than anything. Philip was probably hoping to keep the English distracted and keep them pinned down while he tried to carry on with his invasion of Gascony and Flanders. That's what he's really concerned with. Whereas centuries later, Hitler's real concern was defeating Russia on his eastern flank. And the invasion of Britain, while we make a big deal out of it, was probably not really his priority. And when it turns out on both occasions that it's not really feasible, they kind of, both Philip and Adolf, they sort of gave it up and said, oh, okay, never mind. But still, returning to Adam, he's about 76 years old, if not older, and he's still being employed on these important jobs. You know, he's been given these important commissions. And he remains in service, in active service, to his dying day. He eventually dies, finally, in 1305, just 2 years before his master, Edward I. And one of the last sort of direct references to Adam Gurdon is an order in 1305 for him to put on his armour yet again, assemble horses and arms and soldiers, and go north to fight in Scotland in Edward's penultimate Scottish campaign. So Adam, at this point, he's got to be about 85, 86, and yet he's still being summoned to go and fight the king's enemies. Now, it's almost impossible to imagine a man of that age being any sort of use at all on the battlefield. I mean, unless he's a bit of a physical freak. But he's obviously still valued, and the turnaround in his career and in how he is perceived by the king is quite remarkable. You're talking about a man who went from being very much a rebel knight, a threat to the peace, a public enemy, who actually fights the king's son in single combat, which is, you know, not a very common thing at all. It's kind of unheard of, really. And he's converted into a useful subject, a loyal subject, who spends decades in service to the crown. And eventually dies more or less in harness with his boots on, which is appropriate for a man who spent his entire life as a fighting soldier. We don't know the circumstances of his death. He probably didn't actually make it up to Scotland. The instruction was sent out, but Adam is, if not dead already by the time it's dispatched, he certainly dies soon afterwards. Maybe he died halfway up to Scotland, sort of fell off his horse and gently expired on the roadside, we don't know. But that was the end of Adam. Quite an epic career. He left several children who inherited his estates in Hampshire and Dorset. And yet that is the conclusion of the tale of Adam Gurdon, one of the most sort of, if not incredibly important, certainly one of the more sort of charismatic and fascinating characters of this period. And an example of how a king like Edward I was able to convert former enemies into useful subjects, into friends and lieutenants, very effectively. So that's it for Adam. As I said, I've posted a link to my upcoming book below, and hopefully I'll speak to you again later.